So most of us in the room probably know the importance of this date, December 7th, 1941. What happened on that day? Pearl Harbor. How many of you know what happened in the South China Sea on December 10th, 1941? Anybody know your British history? No? Okay. So December 10th, 1941, off the coast of what is now Myanmar, there was a British ship, a naval ship, that was bombed by the Japanese. It's called the British Pearl Harbor. Aboard that ship, there was a 19-year-old British sailor. His name was Maurice Pink. He was down below on the third deck on the phone when one of the bombs hit the ship and threw him across the room. After the blast hit, all of the power went out over the whole ship, as you can imagine, and he's in there in the dark, and suddenly he feels it getting wet where his feet are, and he knows what's about to happen. Pitch black, no way out, doesn't know where he is, he just knows he's going to die there. There happens to be a fellow sailor down on the third deck with him who has a flashlight. He turns on the flashlight, and they try to look around the room to try to find a way out. And to their dismay, the only obvious way out is blocked by a huge thing of debris. And so in their panic, they look around, think, there's got to be a way out, there's got to be a way out. And so they see a small ladder that they know leads up into the captain's quarters on the second deck. And so they find their way with the flashlight as the water's rising and the boat is sinking up this ladder and get into the second deck where the captain's quarters is. So once they're there, using the flashlight, they find a relief hatch that, to their surprise, actually isn't jammed or broken or mangled in all of this wreckage. So they open the escape hatch to the top deck, and they see around them this scene of horror, this scene of just, it's crazy. There's flames here, there's smoke here, there's men running everywhere, and they have to decide, what are we going to do? The boat's going to sink. And so Maurice, he decides quickly, 19 years old, he gets on the edge of the boat, and he jumps into the South China Sea. And while he's there, he's got a decision to make. He knows if I get too close to the boat, it's going to suck me under with it. And if I get too far out, these waters are known to be shark infested. If I get too far out, I'm on my own, I'm going to get eaten alive. And so in this in-between, in this uncertainty, am I going to drown? Am I going to get eaten? What's going to happen to me? He does what any of us would do. He starts quoting the 23rd Psalm. That's what you would do in that situation, right? That's what I know I would do. And calm, cool, collected at 19, I would definitely quote Psalm 23. So he does this. He goes on for about an hour, over and over and over, quoting the 23rd Psalm, until a British rescue boat comes by and pulls him up to safety. He writes about this later in his journal, and he says, the reason that I thought about this psalm was because in that moment, I felt that was my valley of the shadow of death. That's the first thing I thought of when I'm in the water. I'm going to die. And so the only thing I could think to do was to quote this psalm. And he said, as I quoted this psalm over and over and over for an hour, the truth of verse number 4 came to my mind. In the middle of all that chaos, in the middle of all that uncertainty, this 19-year-old British sailor quoted this psalm thinking about verse 4. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. But today we're going to talk about this verse, Psalm 23, verse 4, in week 5 of this series 23. We're going through the 23rd Psalm. We'll finish it up next week. It's going to be an amazing week to finish up. But today we're going to look at this verse, verse number 4, and see how powerful it can be for us. Let's read it, and then we'll hop into breaking it down really phrase by phrase through this verse. Psalm 23, verse 4. David writes, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Today we're talking about the valley. It's going to start out as really a bummer, and then it gets better from there, okay? So we're going to jump off the top of this, sinking ship into the water, but then we're going to get rescued. It'll be okay. Now, you may not have had a bomber blow up the ship that you're in, but you probably have gone through some kind of valley. Maybe more than one at the same time. Maybe even right now in this room, listening to me talk, you're going through a valley or multiple valleys. So what we're going to do today is try to give ourselves some encouragement in talking about what do we do in the midst of those valleys. What I want us to do is learn a few things about ourselves and our situation that we might find ourselves in, and then remind ourselves a few things about God in the midst of the valleys that we face. So we're going to go kind of phrase by phrase and see what David might tell us, what wisdom we can learn from this verse this morning. The first phrase that we see here, he says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. So spoiler alert, if you haven't faced any valleys in your life, you will. I know that's a big shock to all of us in the room because you've probably never faced anything wrong before. But it happens, right? It's normal. It's natural. It's a universal truth. And to illustrate that, I've got this very kind of simple, crude, 3-year-old kind of drawing on purpose to illustrate the simplicity of life. You start out there on the left, on the tip top. You're a baby. Everything's great. Not a care in the world. You don't even know, that you what you need to do. It's just wonderful. It's bliss. And then basically from then on, it's just downhill. Okay? And then you go through valleys, and then you go back up. So here's what this illustration points out. Most of our existence is either in a valley, coming out of a valley, or going into a valley. 95% of your life plus is either in a valley, coming out of a valley, or going into a valley. So here's my encouragement today. Whenever you find yourself in a mountaintop situation in your life, bask in that moment as long as you can, because it will not come again for a while. It will not last very long. And so if you find yourself, man, the world is right, life is good, enjoy that. Live in that. Soak it up, baby, because it's going to be a downhill slope from there into a deep valley, then a steep climb upward to your next sort of moment, if you will. So enjoy those moments because they are rare. David says, I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. So just because you're going through a valley doesn't mean that God's picking on you. Scripture says it rains on the just and the unjust. Those valleys will happen. No matter how far you feel like you are from God, you're going to have valleys. No matter how close you feel you are to God, you're going to have valleys. It's a fact of life. It's a certainty. So it's not that God's picking on you or making you feel like there's something wrong with you. That's the other thing. A valley in your life doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you, but there are maybe at least two different types of reasons why we have valleys. So it may not be there's anything wrong with you, but it's possible you're in a valley because you did something wrong. Okay, David knows this. We talked about it last week. He knows this very well. One of the lowest points in his life is after he messed everything up. God gave him the perfect life on a silver platter, and somehow he figured out a way to blow it up to shreds. And he finds himself writing, Psalm 51 out of the depths of despair, out of the worst moment of his life because of the mess that he made. So maybe if you're taking honest inventory of your life, you would say maybe one of the valleys, or maybe the valley I'm in right now, is of my own making. Maybe a harsh word or an angry action has ruined or fractured a relationship. And you can try to point fingers and place blame, but ultimately it begins and ends with me. I'm in the valley because of myself. Maybe a poor financial decision has left you financially ruined. You can't blame anybody but yourself. You can't blame your financial planner because, that you can't trust them anyway. I'm just kidding. You can't blame, well, they said you should buy this or they said you should invest, but you made the decision or you wanted that purchase and now you regret it. Sometimes we're in those valleys of our own doing. Sometimes unhealthy life choices lead to unhealthy life consequences. We're in the physical state we are because of repeated mistakes in living in a healthy way. Maybe we're in this of our own doing. There's also the kind of valley where I'm not really responsible for this, but somebody else might be. And David knows this truth as well. Early in David's life, before he's king, he's the son-in-law of the king, King Saul, married to King Saul's daughter. And for no fault of David's, Saul literally goes insane. He loses his mind. And twice he tries to spear David to death. They're sitting there having a great meal. All of a sudden, shing, he's like, cut his earlobe off or whatever. His father-in-law is chasing him around the country with a small army for years, trying to kill him. Tim, I'm watching you. Warren, I'm watching you. Father-in-laws, I'm watching you, okay? So, David knows sometimes my valleys that I'm in, I'm not really to blame for, but I'm still in them. And maybe that's where you would find yourself. Maybe a relationship went south and you tried hard and you tried to follow all the right steps and say the right words and they still turn their back on you and you find yourself kind of just in despair about that situation. Maybe you lost your job not due to bad performance, but because the economy just hit that industry hard that you found yourself working in. You can't control those things, but you're still in the valley nonetheless. Then there are families even in our own city who almost nightly, we read about some crazy act of random violence, even in our own city. Families all over Kansas City are affected just in that way. Nothing that they can do about it, nothing that they caused it. They still have to deal with those types of valleys. Maybe you find yourself in one of those. So the bad news as we get started, we're jumping off the ship here, okay? The bad news is valleys will come. Valleys will happen. David says, I walk through them. He understands this is going to happen. So that's the bad news. Let's get to the better news. The next phrase in this verse is this. It's a big statement. It's a hefty statement. He says, I will fear no evil. Fear no evil. Let's look at a couple of scriptures. Psalm 56, another psalm that David wrote. He writes this, verse 11. He says, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? So David wrote this. If you look at the beginning of Psalm 56, it tells you the circumstance that David finds himself in. He's been captured by the Philistine army. He's a prisoner of war, and he writes Psalm 56. I trust in God. I fear no evil. What can man do to me? Well, they could kill you. And he's like, well, that's about it. That's as bad as it can get. Bring it on. Next, David's very confident in God's power to protect him in any situation, any valley in which he finds himself. Psalm 46, one of my favorite scriptures in all the Bible, says this. Psalm 46, verses 1 through 3. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. The author here says, even when everything is literally falling apart, I will choose not to live in fear. I will choose to not be overcome by fear. Let me make one quick distinction, however, in that. There's a difference between being afraid and living in fear. Those are two different things. They are not the same thing. It's natural to be afraid at times. It's a self-preservation thing that we have within us, fear. It motivates us sometimes. So because I don't want to die, I'm not going to jump into a pool of sharks. I have enough fear / common sense in there somewhere, right, that I'm not going to make that kind of decision. Fear can sometimes be a positive thing and a useful thing. But living in fear is never useful. Living in fear is never productive. Living in fear always leads to a consequence that we don't want to happen. So it can lead to two different things that I've really thought about this week. So as life throws things at us, as we find ourselves in valleys, out of valleys, in between, in multiple valleys, living in fear can lead to either inaction or overaction, neither of which is going to be a good result. So inaction. So sometimes you're in a valley, you're facing maybe big decisions, life decisions, like monumental decisions. So if we live in fear, we can become frozen. A decision must be made. Something has to be done. I have to choose one or the other option, but I don't know what to do. I'm afraid of failing. I'm afraid of letting people down. I'm afraid of disappointing everyone, and so I'm not going to do anything. And then then the valley becomes a quicksand valley, and we go under, and it just leads to nowhere. On the other hand, though, we can go on the total opposite end of that spectrum, and living in fear can lead to overaction, where instead of not doing anything, I do the first thing that comes to my mind, which is usually not the smartest thing to do. It's maybe like an impulse buy. I'm never going to have this deal again on this car, and I really can't afford it, but it's the cheapest it's ever going to get, so I'm going to buy it. And then what happens? Buyer's remorse, okay? So we can do that in any area of life. In a relationship, I'm single, they're single, they have a pulse, let's date, okay? And that usually is not the greatest criteria for dating someone. But sometimes, out of fear, I'm never going to get this opportunity for my Prince Charming or whatever again, and so I'm just going to, marry them. We'll live happily ever after, and you live, for a few months, and it ends terribly, and you feel like you wasted all that time. We could do it in every kind of area of our lives if we're not careful. I take this job offer because I'm never going to get a job offer like that ever again, and then you end up having a job that you hate that's not what you thought it was, and if you would have waited, and that's hard to do, but if we would have waited and not have this overaction because we're living in fear, this will never happen again, this opportunity will never come again, we might be in a different type of spot. But David says, I will fear no evil. He says, I will not be manipulated by fear. I will not be moved through fear. I will not be frozen by fear. I refuse to live that way. Dallas Willard, I quoted him earlier in this series. He wrote a book called Living Without Lack. He's a professor and an author. And he writes this to encourage us in our valleys and in fear. He says, I want you to think about what if your worst fear actually came true. Just imagine for a second, whatever that thing is, whatever that valley is, whatever that I don't want to go there. Go. He says, just go there for a second. What if your worst fear actually came true? He says, now ask yourself two questions. One, where would I be if this actually came true? And that can lead to a dark place for a second. It can lead to despair. It can lead to hopelessness. It can lead to even more fear, okay? But the second question he says to ask is not just where I would be. He says, imagine your worst fear came to pass. Where would I be if this happened? And then secondly, what would happen to God if that worst fear came true? Now, if God is who he claims to be, he's still going to be okay. Your worst fear coming true is not going to catch him off guard. It's not going to surprise him. It's not going to make him fearful or unsure. It's not going to make him say, ooh, I didn't see that one coming. That was a curveball that life threw at you. Wasn't prepared for that. Let me just get my plan together and then we'll no, it's not. God is always prepared. He must have been a Boy Scout. I don't know. Maybe he was. But he says, don't just ask where would you be, but ask what would happen to God if this happened. And if God is who he claims to be, we can truly be like David and have no fear. Even in the midst of evil, even in the midst of the darkest valley, even in the midst of the most uncertain time in your life, you can truly have no fear. And here's why. The next statement is, because you are with me, David says. He says, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. That word you is important. And here's why. So far in this psalm, God has been referred to as he. Okay? He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. But here's where it gets different. In the valley, the he becomes a you. Notice he doesn't say, I fear no evil, for he is with me. He says, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. So for David, in his valley, things got really personal. He knew, okay, God's not just a good idea in life now. I need him to be personal to me. God's just not a thing that I do on one day of worship once a week, but now I need you, God. I don't just need him to be, I need you. It gets personal. It gets deep for David. And I would say for most of us in the room, most of us in life, that's true. Things get personal in the valley. It's in those moments, in those valleys where we discover, I really do need God. He really is more than just a nice thought or an idea or a supplement to my life. He's everything. And that's what David recognizes here in his valley, that you are with me. I think about the successor to Moses. You know, Moses, he's a pretty big deal, right? God gave him the 10 Commandments. He spoke to him face to face. Moses is kind of a big deal. So think about the guy following that for a second. His name's Joshua, and he's been with Moses for years, been his right-hand man, been his assistant. He's seen it, done it with Moses, but it's different now because he's about to take over for Moses. So it's one thing if you're, like the vice president and you've seen it all, done it all. It's another thing if now you are the president. That's different, altogether different. And that's what's happening here with Joshua. Now all of a sudden, the things that he thought he knew, he's probably second-guessing those things because now it counts. Now it matters. Now what he says and does has an effect on people. And so he's there. I can just imagine when he's kind of being commissioned and he's taken over, he's probably thinking, someone else is probably more qualified than I am to do this, right? There's 2 million of us. Somebody can do this better than me. Or, man, I thought I was really sure of myself when I was with old Mo here, but now that he's not here, I'm not sure what to do. I'm kind of, not sure. So here's what God does as his sort of coronation, if you will. Joshua chapter 1, verses 5 and 6. Here's what God says to Joshua, knowing what he's sensing internally. God says, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. So God knows what's going on in Joshua's mind, in his heart, and he knows the uncertainty. He can feel the sweaty palms. He can sense the shaking of the nerves. He can sense the unsureness of Joshua. And so he says, hey, I was with Moses, wasn't I? Clearly I was. I'll be with you. And what that means, think about when Moses was called. 40 years before, reverse 40 years back at the burning bush, Moses was not, I'm Moses with a flowy beard and I know what I'm doing. He was a scared little girl too. Right? He tried to talk God out of this plan of being the deliverer. So God says, you didn't see the full picture. You didn't see what I had to work with, Joshua. I didn't have a lot to work with, and look what happened. Look what I can do. Certainly I can do that with you. If I'm calling you to do this, I'll lead you through it. I will be with you. And I would say God would say the same thing to every one of us today. Whatever valley you find yourself in, whatever situation you're facing, whatever difficulty you might be walking through, whatever tragedy or loss you may have suffered, you are not alone. God says, as I was with Moses, I'll be with you. As God was with Moses, he'll be with you. As God has been with your neighbor through stuff, he'll be with you. As God's been with other people in this church, he'll be with you. He's faithful to do that. He's big enough and powerful enough to be with you too. Yes, you, even in what you're facing, even in what you're enduring, even through the pain and the heartache of what you may be walking through, he is there with you. And then in the New Testament, Jesus has this sort of difficult conversation in John 16 with his disciples. And he's saying, hey, things are about to change, guys. I'm going to be crucified, and I'm going to rise from the dead, but I'm not going to be here with you forever. You're going to kind of be on your own at this point. Similar to what Joshua was going through. The mantle's being passed, the torch is being passed from Moses to Joshua. And Jesus in John 16 is saying, hey, I'm going to pass the torch to you guys now. I'm going to leave you guys in charge. I can't believe I'm saying this, guys, but I'm going to leave you guys in charge. And so he says this, and they're kind of fearful, as you can imagine. If you think following Moses was hard, following Jesus is going to be even a step above that. And he's saying it's going to take at least 12 for you to do this, to even try to do this, but I'm going to trust you to do that. But here's what he says, John 16:33. Jesus, after saying all of that and seeing all of their fear and uncertainty, he says this, I've said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So Jesus basically is saying here, hey guys, whatever you're facing, been there, done that, got the t-shirt, right? I'm not going to be here physically, but my spirit's going to be here. You can trust me. You can believe in me. I'm going to lead you and guide you where you need to go, where the church is supposed to go, where the impact can be made. I'm doing what I'm going to do for your good. I want you to do it through my power. You're not alone. He says the same thing that God said to Joshua a couple thousand years before. There's a man who was named Alan Emery, and in the middle part of the 20th century, he was a huge giant in the wool industry. And he actually sat on a bunch of college and university boards. He actually was a chairman on the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association board, but he was huge in the wool industry. And so as a boy, he began his career as any guy in that industry would, out in the fields with sheep, with his dad. And so he tells a story, he writes a story about one night, he's out with about 2,000 sheep. Just him and his dad and 2,000 sheep in the middle of this field. And they're laying down at night to go to bed, and it's pitch black, and they have a small fire by him and his dad where they're making a meal. And so as they're putting out the fire and as they're getting ready to go to bed, in the distance they hear a huge pack of coyotes. And he said, and we kind of shot up, obviously, because that got our attention. And he said, I looked at the sheep, and he said, I noticed something interesting about the sheep. And here's what he wrote. He says, in the midst of danger, the sheep were not looking out into the darkness, but were keeping their eyes set in the direction of their safety, looking toward the shepherd. Can I encourage you in your valley to do that? To not look inward at what's going on, to not look downward in defeat like it's over, but to look to, Hebrews says, Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Can I just encourage you that looking at how bad things are isn't going to make them magically better? It's going to make you feel worse about it. Looking at trying to figure out who I can blame or how I can, feel better, but it's not going to help. Looking at the situation doesn't help. Looking in the darkness doesn't help, but looking to the shepherd to lead me and guide me through this valley is the only choice that we have. It's the only answer that's going to make any sense in our lives. So we can look at our valley and see all the darkness and fear. We can look to the shepherd and find direction. The last statement that David makes in this verse number 4 of Psalm 23, he says this. He says, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now, he uses that, it's really the same instrument, but in two different ways. Okay, the shepherd's crook. So the staff, let's go to the staff first. So the staff is going to lead from the front. The shepherd's in the front with his staff. If I look up, I can see the staff and I can know which way to go. And that's what God did. We go back to the beginning of Israel's history out of Egyptian bondage. They leave Egyptian bondage, and they have this vast desert in front of them. They don't know where to go. There's no GPS, right? They don't know what they're doing, where they're going. They have no sense of direction. And so God provides that direction for them. So as soon as they leave Egypt, God provides this huge cloud that they follow for direction during the daytime. And then at nighttime, he provides this huge, it says, the pillar of fire to light their way even through the darkness. So no matter what the situation was, no matter what time of day it was, no matter how much they could see or couldn't see, God provided direction for them. That's what the staff of the shepherd does for us. It provides direction from the front. Now the rod, on the other hand, is going to provide some direction from the back. We talked about last week, sometimes we want to get off the path, and that's when he's going to kind of whack. No, you go back that way. God will do that. That's part of the rod and staff, but it's a comfort, okay? Because I'd rather be kind of whacked on the bottom to get on the right path than get way off on the wrong path and live my life years and years and years with regret and poor decisions and consequences. I'd rather have that. Not the moment, but in the long run, yes. Sometimes when we talk about we're frozen in fear, God's going to have to be like, scoot along, little sheep. We got to go. We're not waiting for you. Let's go. And he's going to do that from the back with the rod. But the true comfort here comes from the rod and the staff comforting us through protection. So in the late 1800s, you think about cowboys and Indians out west. You think about cops and robbers out west. But just after the Civil War, the second half of the 19th century out west, sheep outnumbered cattle by about 50%. And so we think about cowboys and all these cattle herders, but sheep outnumbered cattle by about 50%. And so for about a 40 to 50-year period out west, there were what they were called sheep wars. And it was literally shepherds fighting cattle herders for land out west, for their flocks and for their cattle. And literally, like, we're talking war, we're talking fights, we're talking battles, we're talking gunfights, we're talking knife fights, we're talking death and destruction. So there are even stories in Texas and Colorado and even in Wyoming that where one battle at a time, hundreds, if not thousands of sheep are slaughtered by cattlemen. We're talking about in the 1890s, a historian said in that last decade alone, nearly 500,000 sheep were killed by cattlemen trying to win the sheep war. If you don't have sheep, you don't need land, we'll take the land from you. Not only were the sheep killed, but the shepherds were killed. In that same decade, during the 1890s, during the height of the sheep wars out west, it was estimated that about 500 shepherds were murdered by cattlemen. Because if we can get you, the sheep will run everywhere, we can get them too. And yet, you read story after story after story of courageous shepherd who would give his life for his sheep. Literally. They're killed in the middle of the night, they're killed in battle, they're killed in a gunfight or a knife fight over land. But these shepherds, time and time again, would always defend the flock. They would withstand any opposition to the death if necessary for the safety and protection of their sheep. Can I submit to you that that's what God does? His rod and staff doesn't just comfort us by directing us, but it also protects us. If God needs to bang some heads, he'll do that. He's very handy with a rod and a staff. If he needs to protect you from someone or something in your life, whether it's physical or spiritual, he will absolutely do anything he has to do to protect us. Think of it this way. He did everything he could to get us into the fold. Don't you think he's going to do whatever he can to keep us safe in the fold? I think he will. But that leads to the main point as I want to close on this. This leads to the main point as we sum up this entire verse here, verse 4. It's an important distinction to make about valleys. I want to read two scriptures, and then we'll kind of we'll land the plane here, if you will. Romans 8:28 says this: we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purposes for them. Psalm 126, verses 5 and 6. Those who plant in tears will harvest with shouts of joy. They weep as they go in to plant their seed, but they sing as they return with the harvest. So here's the main point of this verse that I want us to get before we leave today. Let me ask you a few questions. I believe these verses are true. Absolutely. So does God work out all things for the good of his people? Yes, every time, without fail. Can God turn your valley into a victory? Absolutely, every time, without fail. But does that mean that every time, all the time, God will keep us from being in valleys? No. We said at the outset, valleys are inevitable. Struggle is inevitable. Loss, disappointment, pain, it's inevitable. So, David doesn't write this psalm. He doesn't say, I fear no evil because you keep me from the valley. It's not what he says. He doesn't say, I fear no evil because you rescue me from the valley at the very beginning of the valley. I didn't have to walk that far. Yay, God. It's not what he says. He says, I fear no evil because you are with me through the valley, all the way through. So, can God keep us from valleys? Sure. And I think most of the time we're even unaware of him doing that. We don't know what God does because something didn't happen. We don't see the protection that God gives because something didn't happen. I think that happens all the time, yes. Well, it happens a lot, but not every time, I should say. Now, can God, you're in a valley, it's a hard, week of something, and God rescues you after a week. Can he do that? Yeah. Has he done that? Yeah. He doesn't always do that. So I don't want us to walk away today saying, okay, God, here's what I want us to do. I want us to pray as if God will rescue me right now from whatever I'm going through, but to trust him even if he doesn't. Like, I want to have the faith to believe, okay, God, right now, snatch me out of this despair. Snatch me out of this terrible situation. Rescue me or keep me from ever falling in the ditch. And he can, and I believe sometimes he will, but here's the thing. Even if he doesn't, will we still follow the shepherd? Even through the valley, will we still trust him? Even through the difficulty, will we still fear no evil because he's still with us? Yes, even in the valley, even through the difficulty, even despite the pain that I see all around me, even though everything's been blown up in my life, will I still trust the shepherd? Well, God, you didn't keep me from that. That's not the point of this psalm. He's not saying, because you keep me from the valley. It's not what he's saying. He's saying, in the valley, I trust you. Despite the valley, I trust you. Even through the rocky terrain, I follow you anyway. If I got bloody feet and broken ankles, I'm going to crawl if I have to follow the shepherd. That's the determination that David shows here. That's the kind of grit that he expresses. That's the kind of faith that he has that I want us to have. That life is not always what we want it to be, what we hope to be, what we planned it would be, but will we still follow the shepherd? Because even if he doesn't keep us from something, he'll bring us through something. And I believe that with all my heart. God's faithful and powerful enough to bring us through anything that we face. If God is your shepherd, and I hope that he is, if God is your shepherd, you can truly fear no evil because he is certainly with you. He's guiding, he's leading, he's protecting, not from always, but sometimes through. He'll protect you through things, and you mean it could be worse? I guess. I guess it could be. I don't know. I don't know your situation. I don't know all the situations in the room. But I know that God is faithful to lead us and guide us and protect us even when we do walk through those valleys. We can trust him, and he is faithful.